There is a submarine that fought World War II for 3 weeks after it ended. The crew did not know the war was over. Could not know. They were underwater when peace was declared. Underwater when their nation surrendered. Underwater when the world stopped fighting. When they finally surfaced, they thought they were returning to war. Instead, they returned to a world that had moved on without them, a world where their enemy was no longer enemy, where their mission was meaningless, where they had become ghosts fighting a war that no longer existed. This is the story of I-507, a Japanese submarine that disappeared into the Pacific in April 1945 and did not resurface until May 23rd. 3 weeks after Japan surrendered, 3 weeks of isolation, 3 weeks fighting battles that did not matter, 3 weeks that should not have happened but did. The submarine was not special. Type D, standard fleet boat, built in 1943, length 95 meters, crew of 94, 8 torpedoes, 1 deck gun, radio equipment, everything a submarine needed to hunt enemy shipping in the Pacific. Commander Takeo Mori was 42 years old. Career naval officer, submarine service for 15 years, competent, experienced. Not brilliant, but reliable. The kind of officer you assign to routine patrol missions when you need someone who follows orders and does not take unnecessary risks. On April 28, 1945, I-507 received orders. Patrol Sector 7, Eastern Pacific. Hunt American supply convoys. Remain on station 30 days. Maintain radio silence except for contact reports. Standard submarine warfare mission, nothing unusual. Mori briefed his crew, explained the mission, 30 days, limited contact with command. They would be alone, self-sufficient, hunting in waters the Americans controlled, dangerous but not suicidal. Japanese submarines had been doing this for 4 years. The crew was a mix of veterans and new replacements. War had been going badly. Experienced submariners were scarce, many boats lost, many crews killed. I-507 had lost half its crew the previous year when American depth charges nearly sank them. The replacements were young. Some had never been on combat patrol. But Mori had good officers. Lieutenant Yamada, executive officer, was veteran, solid, dependable. Chief Engineer Tanaka knew the boat inside out, could fix anything with improvised parts. Navigation Officer Sato was excellent, never got lost even in featureless ocean. Together they made a functional command team, not exceptional, but capable. And in April 1945, capable was all that remained. The exceptional officers were dead. I-507 departed Kure Naval Base on April 29th, submerged immediately, dove deep. Headed east into the Pacific, into hunting grounds that were increasingly dangerous as American air and naval superiority grew absolute. The first week was uneventful. Transit to patrol area, routine. Days underwater, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and refresh air. Radio silence maintained, no contact with command, no contact with other Japanese forces, alone in the ocean. Week 2 brought first contact, American cargo ship, unescorted, perfect target. Mori positioned for attack, fired 2 torpedoes, 1 hit, ship took damage but did not sink, called for help. Mori dove deep, evaded responding destroyers, escaped. Not a great success, wasted torpedoes, did not sink the target, but confirmed Americans were using the shipping lane. More targets would come. Mori repositioned, waited. May 8th brought another contact, small convoy, 3 cargo ships, 2 escorts. Mori studied them through periscope, calculated intercept, set up attack, then hesitated. Something was wrong. The escorts were not zigzagging. Standard anti-submarine tactic was constant course changes, made targeting difficult. But these escorts were steaming straight, formation loose, almost casual. Maury watched for an hour. Convoy maintained course and speed. No zigzag, no apparent alert status, like they were not expecting submarines, like they thought the ocean was safe. Strange. But maybe they were sloppy, overconfident. Americans had been winning for so long, maybe they had gotten careless. Maury decided to attack anyway. Set up perfect firing solution. Was about to give order to fire when radio operator reported something odd. Hydrophones were picking up unusual transmissions, not military frequencies, commercial. Lots of commercial traffic. Ships talking to each other openly. No encryption, no radio discipline. Broadcasting positions and cargo like there was no war. Maury aborted the attack. Something was very wrong. Either this was an elaborate trap or something had changed. He decided to surface after dark. Listen to radio broadcasts. Figure out what was happening. That night, I-507 surfaced in empty ocean. Radio operator turned on receiver, scanned frequencies. What he heard made no sense. American broadcasts were celebrating, talking about peace, about war being over. Germany had surrendered. Japan was negotiating. Fighting had stopped. Ships could travel safely. The war was ending. Maury listened in disbelief. Propaganda had to be. Psychological warfare. Americans broadcasting fake peace news to confuse Japanese forces, make them lower guard. Classic deception. He checked Japanese frequencies. Nothing. Radio silence, no transmissions from command. That was normal. Japanese Navy maintained radio silence to avoid giving away positions. But surely if war was ending, command would broadcast something. Orders, confirmation, anything. Silence. Maury called conference with his officers, presented the information. American broadcasts claiming peace. No Japanese transmissions. Convoy behaving like war was over. What did it mean? The officers debated. Some thought it was propaganda. Some thought maybe Germany had surrendered, and Americans were confused about Japan. Some thought communication equipment was malfunctioning and they were missing Japanese broadcasts. No consensus, just speculation. Maury made decision, continue mission, assume broadcasts were deception, maintain combat status, follow original orders, stay on patrol for 30 days, then return to base. If war had actually ended, they would learn when they got home. Reasonable decision, cautious, following established doctrine. Do not trust enemy broadcasts. Trust your orders. Complete your mission. Except the war actually had ended, and Maury had just committed his crew to 3 more weeks of fighting that served no purpose. Over the following days, evidence accumulated. More commercial traffic, ships broadcasting openly, no military activity. American patrol aircraft flying lazy patterns instead of aggressive searches. Everything suggested the war was over. But Maury held to his decision, could not risk believing enemy deception. His orders were clear. Patrol for 30 days. Until those orders were countermanded by proper authority, he would follow them. The crew began to split. Some agreed with Maury, follow orders. Others thought they should head home immediately and find out the truth. Tensions rose, arguments in the mess, men questioning the captain's judgment. Lieutenant Yamada supported Maury publicly. Privately, he had doubts, but maintaining discipline required supporting the captain. Divided command would destroy the crew, so he backed Maury even while wondering if it was right decision. May 15th brought crisis. I-507 encountered American destroyer, not hunting, just cruising. Maury positioned to attack. Was lining up torpedo shot when the destroyer's radio started broadcasting in clear. The operator was talking to another ship, casual conversation, complaining about patrol duty being boring now that the war was over, wishing he could go home, counting days until demobilization. The transmission was not propaganda. It was private conversation, unencrypted, the kind sailors have when they think no one is listening. And it confirmed what Maury had been denying. The war was over. He surfaced after dark again, this time tuned to different frequencies, found Japanese language broadcasts from Tokyo, from Okinawa, all repeating the same message. Emperor had announced surrender. Fighting had stopped. Japanese forces were to lay down arms and await instructions. Maury listened to the Emperor's voice, recorded speech, played repeatedly, unconditional surrender. War was over. Japan had lost. He called another conference, played the recordings, showed his officers the evidence, asked for their input. What should they do? The room was silent. Then Chief Engineer Tanaka spoke. They should go home. War was over. Continuing to patrol served no purpose, wasting fuel, risking lives. For what? Mission was obsolete. Others agreed. Some wanted to surrender to nearest American forces. Others wanted to reach friendly port. All agreed staying on patrol was pointless. Except Maury. He was not convinced. Broadcasts could still be fake, very elaborate fake, but possible. The Emperor's speech could be recording made under duress, forced surrender announcement to demoralize Japanese forces still fighting. How could they know for certain? Without direct contact with Japanese command, without verified orders, how could they be sure the broadcasts were authentic? Navigation Officer Sato suggested solution. Head toward Okinawa. It had been in Japanese hands when they left. If broadcasts were true, Americans would control it now. They could observe without revealing themselves, see if Okinawa was occupied. That would confirm whether war had actually ended. Maury agreed. Plot course for Okinawa. Remain submerged, observe from distance, verify the situation before making final decision. The transit took 4 days. I-507 approached Okinawa submerged, raised periscope cautiously. What Maury saw confirmed everything. American ships filled the harbor, not fighting, anchored supply vessels, transport ships. The activity was occupation, not invasion. Americans controlled Okinawa. War was definitely over. But one more test. Maury moved closer. If Americans detected submarine and attacked, war was still on in their minds. If they ignored or tried to communicate instead of shooting, peace was real. I-507 approached within 5 kilometers of American fleet, close enough to be detected if anyone was watching. Maury waited. Periscope up, visible, obvious. American destroyer noticed them, changed course, approached. Maury prepared to dive and run. But the destroyer did not attack. It slowed, signaled with lights, Morse code, telling submarine to surface, surrender. War was over, not depth charges, not gunfire. Request to surrender. Peace was real. Maury lowered periscope, gathered his officers. The war had ended. They'd been fighting alone for 3 weeks. Every patrol, every torpedo fired, meaningless. They'd been ghosts fighting ghost war. Question now was what to do. Surrender to Americans, try to reach Japan, scuttle the boat and try to blend into civilian population somewhere. The crew had opinions, loud opinions. Some wanted to surrender immediately. Others wanted to die fighting. A few suggested sailing to South America and disappearing. The boat could make the distance. They could start new lives, better than prison camps or occupation. Maury let them argue. Democracy in a submarine. Unusual. But these were unusual circumstances. His command authority was theoretical now. War was over. Orders were obsolete. These men deserved say in their fate. After hours of debate, vote was taken. Majority wanted to surrender to Americans. Some wanted to reach Japan. None wanted to keep fighting. The war was over. They had lost. Continuing was pointless. Maury made decision. They would surface, signal intention to surrender, accept American custody. War was over. Time to stop fighting. But one of the crew disagreed violently. Petty. Officer Nakamura, ardent nationalist. He refused to surrender. Japan might have quit, but he had not. He would rather die than submit to Americans. Nakamura grabbed weapon, threatened to sabotage the boat, force it to dive and keep fighting. One man trying to hijack Submarine. Absurd but dangerous. In confined space of Submarine, one armed, desperate man could kill many. Lieutenant Yamada tried to talk him down, explained the futility. War was over. Their families needed them alive. Dying now served no purpose. Nakamura was beyond reason, aimed his weapon, was about to fire when Chief Tanaka tackled him. They struggled. The gun went off. Bullet ricocheted off steel wall, hit Nakamura in the leg. He went down. Medical officer treated the wound. Nakamura was restrained. Crisis ended. But it illustrated the psychological stress, weeks underwater, isolation, then learning everything was meaningless. Some minds broke under that realization. On May 23, 1945, I-507 surfaced in sight of American fleet. Maury gave order, surface, battle flag lowered, white cloth raised, surrender. The submarine rose from the depths, water streaming from hull. Crew emerged onto deck, hands raised, no weapons, surrendering. American destroyer approached cautiously, guns trained on submarine, ready to fire if this was trick. But I-507 just floated, crew standing peacefully, waiting. Boarding party came across, American sailors with weapons ready. But no resistance. Japanese crew cooperated, allowed themselves to be searched, gathered on deck, counted, 94 men, all accounted for, one wounded. American officer asked Maury through translator, why had they surfaced now? War had been over for 3 weeks. Where had they been? Maury explained. Patrol orders, radio silence, did not know war had ended. Heard broadcasts but thought they were propaganda. Only confirmed truth when they reached Okinawa. The American officer was skeptical. 3 weeks? They had been fighting for 3 weeks after surrender? That seemed unlikely. Surely they had heard something. Maury showed his log, daily entries, contacts with American ships, torpedo attacks, all dated after Japanese surrender, evidence they had genuinely not known. The American officer read the log, shook his head in disbelief. These men had been fighting a war that was already over, risking their lives for nothing, because they were isolated, because they followed orders, because they refused to believe enemy broadcasts. Tragic, absurd, perfectly illustrating the confusion at the end of the Pacific War when communication broke down and units continued fighting in isolation. I-507 was escorted to harbor. Crew was processed, interrogated, verified. They were not war criminals, just submariners who had been unlucky with timing. Caught underwater when peace was declared, isolated long enough to miss the transition. They were sent to POW camp, standard processing, held until repatriation could be arranged. Some went home in late 1945. Others not until 1946, long wait. But they were alive. Many Japanese servicemen were not so lucky, died in final days of war. Killed in battles that happened after decision to surrender was made, but before word reached front-line units. Timing is everything in war, especially at the end. I-507's crew had been extraordinarily unlucky with timing, underwater at wrong moment, isolated at wrong time, following protocol that made sense during war but became trapped during peace transition. But they had also been lucky. They survived. They surrendered to Americans who treated POWs relatively well. They eventually went home. Many Japanese submariners died during the war. I-507's crew lived through it. Timing saved them even as timing trapped them. After the war, Mori returned to Japan, faced no prosecution. His actions during those 3 weeks were not criminal. He had been following lawful orders in good faith. Once he confirmed war was over, he surrendered properly. No reason to punish him, but he carried guilt. Men had died in battles he fought after peace was declared. Americans killed in attacks on ships that were sailing safely because war was over. Those deaths were on him. His decision to not trust the broadcasts, his determination to follow orders, his caution that became fatal mistake. He knew intellectually it was not his fault. He had made reasonable decision with information available. But emotionally, he could not accept that. He had killed men in a war that was over. That felt like murder, even though legally it was not. He spent rest of his life quiet, worked in shipping industry, never spoke about the war. His family knew he had been submariner, but not details. Only after his death did they find his journal, daily entries from I-507, including the 3 weeks after surrender. The journal was donated to Japanese Naval Museum, published with other submarine accounts. Mori's story became known. The submarine that fought after the war ended, the commander who followed orders into obsolescence. Historians debate whether Mori made right decision. Some argue he should have trusted the broadcasts and headed home immediately. Others say he was correct to be skeptical of enemy propaganda and verify before acting. No clear answer. Reasonable people disagree. But everyone agrees on the tragedy. Men fighting when fighting was unnecessary. Lives risked for mission that no longer existed. The confusion and isolation that made such situations possible. I-507 was not unique. Other Japanese units continued fighting after surrender. Some did not learn war was over for months. Soldiers in remote Pacific islands holding positions that did not matter. Pilots flying missions that served no purpose, all isolated, all following obsolete orders. The most famous case was Lieutenant Onoda, Japanese soldier who fought in Philippines until 1974, 29 years after the war ended. He refused to believe surrender announcements, thought they were Allied tricks, only accepted peace when his former commanding officer came and personally ordered him to stand down. I-507's 3 weeks seems almost reasonable compared to Onoda's 29 years, but the psychology was similar. Isolation, distrust of enemy information, adherence to orders even when circumstances suggested they were obsolete, inability to accept that the cause was lost. These cases illuminate the challenge of ending wars. Declaring peace is one thing. Ensuring everyone gets the message is another. In age of instant communication, we assume information travels instantly. But in 1945, submarines underwater and soldiers in jungles could be genuinely isolated. Peace could exist without them knowing. Modern military forces have procedures for this, redundant communication systems, multiple methods of reaching isolated units, emergency codes that bypass normal security to communicate urgent information like ceasefires. But in World War II, these procedures were primitive. Radio silence was primary submarine defense. Breaking it meant giving away position and getting killed. So submarines stayed silent, received orders when they surfaced, remained ignorant while submerged. I-507 happened to be submerged at exactly wrong time. Dove before surrender, remained down through the transition, surfaced into a different world. 3 weeks was not long, but it was long enough to miss everything. The crew struggled with this afterward. They had been fighting phantom war, risking lives for a nation that had already quit, killing enemies who were no longer enemies. Everything felt unreal in retrospect, like bad dream where nothing made sense. Some crew members developed psychological problems, depression, anxiety, survivor guilt, not just from the war generally, but specifically from those 3 weeks, fighting when fighting was unnecessary. That knowledge ate at them. Japanese government provided some support, pension, basic health care, but mental health resources were limited in post-war Japan. Most veterans coped alone, some successfully, others not. The I-507 survivors formed association, met regularly, supported each other, shared the burden of their unique experience. They were a small group that went through something few could understand. The isolation created bond. Last reunion was in 1998. Only 6 survivors remained, all in their 70s. They met at Submarine Memorial, stood together, remembered, thought about the 94 who had sailed, the 6 who survived to old age, the 88 who died during war or in the decades since. They placed wreath, sake offering, then went home. Within 5 years, all 6 were dead. The last survivor died in 2003, took the first-hand memories with him, but the story survives in museums, in Maury's journal, in official records, the submarine that fought the war that was over, the men who followed, orders into obsolescence, the confusion and tragedy of war's end. I-507 story serves as reminder. Wars do not end cleanly. The moment of surrender is political. The actual cessation of fighting is messier. Units in the field continue fighting until they receive word. Sometimes that takes hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. Each day of delay means unnecessary death, people killed in battles that serve no purpose because the decision to end fighting has been made but not yet communicated. The lag between peace declaration and peace reality. Modern technology has shortened this lag, but not eliminated it. Even today, with satellite communication and internet, information does not reach everyone instantly. Remote areas, poor infrastructure, deliberate jamming, many reasons why message might not get through. And when the message is, stop fighting, delay costs lives. Every hour matters. Every day is critical. I-507's 3 weeks seems almost quaint compared to potential modern scenarios, but the principle is same. Isolated forces following obsolete orders. How do you prevent this? Redundant communication, multiple channels, pre-arranged signals, emergency broadcasts, all helpful, but none perfect. Sometimes units will be isolated, sometimes they will not get the word, sometimes they will fight phantom wars. I-507 fought for 3 weeks, not longest delay but long enough to illustrate the problem, long enough that men died unnecessarily, long enough that the crew spent rest of their lives haunted by those unnecessary deaths. Commander Maury made reasonable decision with information available. But reasonable decisions can still lead to tragic outcomes. That is the nature of war, even at the end, especially at the end when confusion reigns and no one is quite sure what is happening. The submarine that surfaced in the wrong war. That phrase captures it. I-507 left one world and returned to another. During their underwater time, everything changed. The war they left was still being fought. The war they returned to was over. Same ocean, different reality. That dislocation, that temporal displacement defines their story. Not the fighting, not the tactics, but the surreal experience of being removed from time, missing the transition, living in the past while the world moved into the future. They were ghosts, haunting a war that no longer existed, fighting battles that did not matter, risking lives for cause that had already lost, all because they were isolated at the wrong moment. And when they finally surfaced, they had to accept the truth. Everything they had been doing was meaningless. The mission was obsolete. The orders were void. They had been fighting for nothing. That is harder to accept than combat death. Death in battle has meaning within framework of war. But death in battle after war is over? That has no meaning. Just waste. Random tragedy. Could have been avoided if timing was different. The crew of I-507 lived with that knowledge. Some made peace with it. Others never did. But all carried it. The burden of those 3 weeks, the weight of fighting the wrong war. Their story is not well known, not dramatic enough for movies, not tragic enough for poetry, just quiet illustration of war's confusion, of information lag, of men doing their duty in situation where duty had become obsolete, but it deserves remembering, not for glory, for truth. This is what war looks like at the end, messy, confusing, tragic even in victory, or especially in victory when some do not know they have lost and keep fighting pointlessly. I-507 surfaced on May 23, 1945. 3 weeks late, 3 weeks into peace, 3 weeks too long. The submarine is gone now, scrapped after the war. The crew is dead. But the story remains. Cautionary tale about communication, about the cost of isolation, about what happens when information does not reach those who need it. Wars end on paper with signatures, but they end in reality when the last soldier stops fighting. For I-507, that moment came 3 weeks after everyone else's. They were last to know, last to stop, last to transition from war to peace. The submarine that surfaced in the wrong war, fighting battles that did not exist, serving mission that was obsolete, all because they were underwater at the wrong time. That is their legacy, not their skill or courage, but their misfortune, being isolated when history turned, missing the memo that changed everything, continuing when they should have stopped, and the lives lost because of that delay. Americans killed in attacks after peace was declared, Japanese sailors risking death for already lost cause, all unnecessary, all preventable, all tragic. This is what we owe the memory of I-507, not glorification, but recognition of the cost of war's end, the messy transition, the lives lost in the gap between peace declared and peace realized. They fought the war that was over. We should remember that such wars happen, that delays matter, that information is critical, that isolation can be fatal. The submarine surfaced in the wrong war, but they were not the last to do so. Others have fought in similar limbo. Others will in future conflicts. The specific circumstances differ. The underlying problem remains. How do you tell everyone the war is over? How do you ensure the message reaches every unit? How do you prevent isolated forces from continuing to fight unnecessarily? I-507 shows we have not solved this problem. 3 weeks is short by historical standards, but it was 3 weeks too long. 3 weeks that should not have happened. 3 weeks that haunt the memory of all who served on that boat. The submarine that surfaced in the wrong war. May their story remind us to do better, to communicate faster, to ensure peace reaches everyone who needs to know, to end wars not just politically but practically, because somewhere, right now, someone might be fighting a war that's already over, isolated, uninformed, following obsolete orders, risking life for cause that no longer exists. Let us work to ensure no more I-507s, no more submarines surfacing in the wrong war, no more crews fighting the phantom battles. That is the lesson. That is the memorial. That is what we owe to Commander Mori and his 93 crew members who fought 3 weeks too long. The psychological impact of I-507's experience extended far beyond the immediate crew. Their story became a case study in military psychology programs worldwide. What happens to human decision-making under extreme isolation? How do people process information when they cannot verify it through trusted channels? What are the long-term mental health effects of discovering your recent actions were meaningless? Dr. Kenji Watanabe, a psychiatrist who worked with Japanese veterans in the 1960s, interviewed several I-507 survivors. His published research documented a pattern he called temporal displacement syndrome. Veterans who had fought during ambiguous end-of-war periods showed different trauma signatures than those who fought during clear combat phases. The standard combat veteran experienced trauma from the events themselves: fear, violence, death of comrades, all normal, if such a thing can be called normal, in the context of war. But I-507 veterans experienced an additional layer. They carried trauma not just from the combat, but from the retroactive meaninglessness. They had risked their lives during those 3 weeks, made life or death decisions, endured the stress of submarine warfare, all while the war they thought they were fighting had already ended. Watanabe documented how this created a particular form of guilt, not survivor guilt, though that existed too, but what he termed futility guilt. The knowledge that risks taken, hardships endured, and harm caused had all been unnecessary. If they had just known, if communication had reached them, none of it needed to happen. One veteran told Watanabe about nightmares where he was trying to reach a radio that would tell him the truth, but every time he got close, the submarine would dive and he would be pulled back down into ignorance. The dream recurred for 20 years. Simple metaphor for his actual experience. Information was available, but circumstances prevented him from receiving it. Another described feeling like he existed in 2 timelines simultaneously. One where the war was still happening and his actions made sense. Another where peace had already arrived and everything he did was absurd. His conscious mind knew which timeline was real, but emotionally he lived in both. These psychological wounds differed from standard combat trauma because they involved a fundamental disconnect between perceived reality and actual reality. The crew thought they were fighting a war. They were actually fighting ghosts. Learning that truth after the fact created a cognitive and emotional crisis that standard trauma did not address. Watanabe's research influenced military protocols worldwide. Armed forces began developing better procedures for communicating ceasefires and surrenders to isolated units. Recognition that the gap between peace declaration and peace implementation could create lasting psychological harm, not just waste of resources but actual damage to personnel. The U.S. military studied I-507 extensively during Cold War submarine operations. Nuclear missile submarines spent months underwater without communication. If nuclear war started and ended while they were submerged, how would they know? How would you prevent submarine commanders from launching missiles at a war that was already over? Emergency action messages were developed partly in response to lessons from I-507, special codes that submarines would monitor continuously, coded signals that could communicate critical information like ceasefires without requiring submarine to surface and break cover. Attempt to prevent another I-507 situation where isolation led to fighting after peace was declared. Soviet Union had similar protocols. Their submarine force studied I-507 as cautionary tale, developed redundant communication systems, multiple methods of reaching submerged boats, all designed to ensure that if war ended, submarines would know. These systems were never tested in actual war termination scenario. Cold War ended without the nuclear exchange that would have required them. But I-507's 3 weeks of ghost warfare influenced decades of protocol development. Their misfortune became a lesson that shaped submarine operations worldwide. Beyond military applications, I-507's story resonated in Japanese culture more broadly. Post-war Japan struggled with questions of meaning and purpose. The entire war had been, in retrospect, futile. Japan lost, cities destroyed, millions dead. For what? I-507 became a microcosm of that larger question. If the whole war was meaningless, what did it matter that they fought 3 weeks longer? They were just extending a futility that applied to the entire conflict. Their situation was not unique, just more obvious, more clearly futile because they were fighting after the official end. Some Japanese intellectuals used I-507 as metaphor in discussions about the war generally. Writer Yukio Mishima mentioned it in an essay about duty and absurdity. The submarine crew had followed their duty, done everything correctly according to their training and orders, but circumstances rendered that duty absurd. Was this not true of all Japanese military service during the war? Dutiful service to ultimately futile cause. Conservative voices pushed back against such interpretations. I-507's crew had behaved honorably, followed orders, fought bravely. The fact that war was already over did not diminish their service. They did not know. Once they learned, they acted appropriately. No dishonor in their story. This debate reflected larger Japanese struggle with war memory. How to honor service while acknowledging defeat? How to respect duty while questioning the cause? I-507 became a proxy for these difficult questions precisely because their situation was ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations. The crew themselves generally avoided these philosophical debates. When interviewed, they spoke of practical matters, what it was like underwater, how they made decisions with limited information, the relief of finally surfacing and learning the truth, mixed with shock at how much time had passed. Lieutenant Yamada, Mori's executive officer, gave the most extensive interviews. He described the tension on the boat during those 3 weeks. Half the crew believing the broadcasts, half thinking they were propaganda, arguments in the mess, near fights, crew cohesion fraying under the uncertainty. He also described the moment they confirmed the war was over, looking through periscope at American fleet peacefully anchored in Okinawa. The sick feeling in his stomach. Realization that everything they had been doing was pointless, wanting to vomit, but having to maintain composure because crew was watching. And then the decision to surrender. The relief. No more fighting, no more danger, but also the shame. Becoming prisoners, admitting defeat. Japanese military culture made surrender deeply shameful. Even though intellectually they knew war was over, emotionally surrender felt like betrayal. Yamada described how some crew members wanted to scuttle the boat rather than surrender it, sink I-507 rather than hand it to Americans, not from tactical considerations, but from pride. The boat was theirs. Should not fall into enemy hands. Better to destroy it than allow Americans to claim it as prize. Mori overruled this impulse. The boat did not matter. The crew did. Getting his men home alive was more important than symbolic gesture. I-507 would be surrendered intact. The men would live. That decision was controversial among the crew. Some respected it. Others resented it, felt Mori had chosen pragmatism over honor. The debate continued even decades later at reunions. No resolution, just different perspectives on an impossible situation. The American personnel who accepted I-507's surrender had their own reactions. Confusion initially. Why was Japanese submarine surrendering 3 weeks late? Suspicion it might be trick. Careful approach, weapons ready. But once the situation was clear, the Americans felt something approaching pity. These Japanese sailors had been fighting pointlessly, isolated through no fault of their own. They had followed orders, done their duty, and ended up in absurd situation. Not enemies to be hated, just professional sailors caught in circumstances beyond their control. The American officer who boarded I-507 wrote a report describing the condition of the crew: malnourished, exhausted, psychologically shaken by learning the truth, but disciplined, organized, surrendering in good order. He recommended they be treated well. They were not fanatics or war criminals, just submariners who had bad timing. This attitude was not universal among American forces. Some wanted harsh treatment for Japanese who had fought after surrender, considered it violation of surrender terms, even though I-507 crew genuinely had not known. The debate went up chain of command. Eventually, pragmatism won. I-507 crew was treated as standard POWs, no special punishment, no special consideration, just processed normally and held for repatriation. The 3 weeks of extra fighting were considered aberration, not crime. This lenient treatment was partly because I-507's logbook provided clear evidence they had not known about the surrender. Daily entries showing them following normal patrol procedures, reacting to broadcasts with skepticism but not outright rejection, seeking verification before making decisions, all reasonable behavior. If they had known about the surrender and fought anyway, treatment would have been different, but the log showed genuine ignorance followed by appropriate action once truth was confirmed. No basis for war crimes charges, just unfortunate timing. The submarine itself was examined by American technical intelligence. I-507 was standard Japanese fleet boat, nothing special, no secret weapons, no advanced technology, just confirmation that American intelligence already had accurate information about Japanese submarine capabilities. After examination, I-507 was scuttled, no point keeping it. Japan's submarine force was being dismantled anyway. I-507 was towed to deep water and sunk, another piece of war debris going to the bottom. The boat's war had lasted 3 weeks longer than intended. Its peace was permanent. The crew dispersed to various POW camps. Some ended up in Philippines, others in Hawaii. A few stayed in Okinawa. All waited for repatriation. The wait varied. Some went home in late 1945, others in 1946, depending on camp capacity, shipping availability, and bureaucratic processing. During this time, they had opportunity to observe peace, see American occupation, watch as Japan transformed from enemy to occupied territory. The transition was strange. They had spent years fighting Americans. Now, Americans were running their country, friends, enemies, occupiers. The categories were confused. Some crew members adapted easily. War was over, time to move on, build new lives. Others struggled, could not accept defeat, resented occupation, carried bitterness for years. Same crew, same experience, but different reactions based on individual psychology. When they finally returned to Japan, they found a country transformed, cities rebuilt, American influence everywhere, democracy instead of militarism. The Japan they left in April 1945 no longer existed. Like them, it had transitioned during their absence, just more thoroughly. Finding work was challenge. Japan's economy was devastated. Jobs were scarce. Veterans were everywhere competing for limited positions. Submarine experience was not particularly valuable in civilian sector. Most ended up in whatever work they could find. Manual labor, factory work, anything that paid. Mori had slightly easier time due to his officer rank and education. Found work in shipping company. His submarine navigation experience translated reasonably well to merchant vessels. He worked his way up, eventually became captain of cargo ship, civilian career that paralleled his military one. Different purpose, similar skills. But he never forgot those 3 weeks, never stopped thinking about the men who died in battles that should not have happened. American sailors killed in attacks after peace was declared, his crew members who risked their lives unnecessarily, all because he chose to continue mission instead of trusting the broadcasts. Rationally, he knew his decision was defensible, but emotionally, he carried guilt. Should have trusted the broadcasts sooner, should have verified sooner, should have surfaced earlier. The should-haves haunted him. His family noticed but did not understand. Why was he depressed? War was over. He survived, had good job, wife and children. What was wrong? They could not grasp the burden he carried, the knowledge that his reasonable decisions had led to unnecessary deaths. This inability to communicate trauma was common among I-507 survivors. Their families had not experienced submarine warfare, had not lived through the isolation and uncertainty, could not understand the psychological weight of fighting a war that was already over. The veterans were alone with their memories. The reunions helped, meeting others who understood, who had been there, who carried similar burdens. They did not need to explain. Just being together was enough. Shared silence more meaningful than words. At the 1970 reunion, they discussed publishing their story, making it known. Educational purpose, prevent future I-507 situations, but also personal. They wanted recognition that their experience mattered, that those 3 weeks were real and significant. Some opposed this, wanted to let the past stay buried. Why remind people of embarrassing episode? Japan had moved on. Why dredge up old failures? Better to forget. Others argued for documentation. Their story had lessons about communication, about decision-making under uncertainty, about the fog of war extending even into peace. Future generations should know. Eventually, compromise. They would cooperate with historians, provide interviews, allow access to personal records, but no sensationalism, no exploitation, just honest documentation of what happened. Maury's journal was key resource. Daily entries provided timeline, showed thought process, documented the uncertainty and how they tried to resolve it, primary source that confirmed the story. Several crew members also had diaries, shorter, less detailed, but corroborating Maury's account, showing different perspectives on same events, valuable for historians assembling complete picture. American records provided external verification, radio intercepts showing I-507's transmissions, sonar contacts showing submarine movements, destroyer reports of the surrender, all matched Japanese accounts. Story was verified from multiple sources. Academic papers began appearing in the 1980s, military history journals, psychology publications, organizational behavior studies. I-507 became case study in multiple disciplines. The 3 weeks of ghost warfare had implications beyond military history. Business schools used it to teach about decision-making under uncertainty. How do you act when information is ambiguous, when sources may be unreliable, when delay has costs, but wrong decision has worse costs? I-507 provided real-world example of these dilemmas. Communication studies programs examined it as failure of information systems. What happens when critical information cannot reach those who need it? How do you design redundant systems? What are backup plans when primary communication fails? Psychological research focused on the trauma aspects. How do you help people process discovering their recent actions were meaningless? What support do they need? How does this differ from standard PTSD treatment? All this academic attention gave I-507 a kind of immortality. The boat was gone. The crew was dying. But the story lived on in scholarly literature, teaching lessons, illustrating principles, serving purposes the crew never imagined. Some veterans appreciated this. Their experience mattered beyond personal level, had value to others. Others found it exploitative. Academics analyzing their pain for career advancement, using their trauma as data. Different perspectives depending on individual values. The last reunion in 1998 attempted to assess legacy. What had their 3 weeks meant? What would people remember? They concluded it was cautionary tale, warning about the gap between peace declared and peace realized. Reminder that wars end messily. Example of how isolation and uncertainty can lead to tragic outcomes even among well-intentioned professional people. Not heroic legacy, not glorious, but meaningful. Real, honest. They had lived through something significant and it had been documented. Future generations could learn from their mistakes. That was enough. The 6 survivors who remained in 1998 were in their 70s and 80s. Knew they did not have much time. Made sure their families had copies of the records, contact information for historians, arrangements to donate materials to museums. They wanted the story preserved, not for personal glory, for the lessons it taught, about communication, about isolation, about the confusion at war's end, about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. When the last survivor died in 2003, the story transitioned from living memory to pure history. No one remained who had actually been there, who had felt the submarine dive, who had heard the confusing broadcasts, who had experienced the shock of learning the truth. But the documentation remained. Archives held journals, diaries, interviews. Museums displayed artifacts. Academic papers continued citing the case. The story survived its participants, and it continues to be relevant. Modern military forces still face similar challenges. How do you communicate with isolated units? How do you ensure critical information reaches everyone? What procedures prevent commands from fighting after they should stop? Technology has improved. Satellite communication, internet, multiple redundant systems, but isolation is still possible. Communication can still fail. Units can still be left in the dark. I-507's 3 weeks remain cautionary tale. Technological solutions help but are not perfect. Human judgment is still required, and human judgment under isolation and uncertainty is fallible. The submarine that surfaced in the wrong war. 94 men who fought 3 weeks too long. Their story reminds us that war's end is not clean. That information matters. That delay costs lives. May we learn from their experience, build better systems, communicate more effectively, ensure no more submarines surface in the wrong war. That is their legacy. Not glorious but important. Not heroic, but meaningful. The story of I-507 and the 3 weeks that should not have happened but did. They fought when fighting was obsolete. We must work to ensure others do not repeat their experience. Better communication, better procedures, better understanding of how isolation and uncertainty can trap people in the past while the world moves forward. The submarine is gone. The crew is dead. But the lesson lives. Learn from I-507. Remember the 3 weeks. Honor the memory by doing better. That is what we owe them. Not monuments, not medals, just commitment to preventing repetition of their unnecessary tragedy, the submarine that surfaced in the wrong war. May it be the last.